Most people don't wake up one morning and decide to be weak. Weakness doesn't announce itself. It doesn't crash into our lives. It settles in quietly. It shows up the first time we don't do what we said we would do. The first time we make a promise to ourselves and then explain why it doesn't count. And slowly, invisibly, trust erodes, not trust from others, trust in ourselves. That's where weakness truly begins. Because the problem is not that we don't know what to do. We know, we always know. The problem is that we've trained ourselves to believe that how we feel is more important than what we committed to. And feelings are unreliable leaders. We wait for motivation. We wait for confidence. We wait to feel ready. But readiness is not a feeling. It's a decision. Here's what's uncomfortable to admit. Weakness is rarely about lack of strength. It's about lack of follow-through. And the most dangerous thing about weakness is that it feels reasonable. Skipping once feels harmless. Quitting early feels justified. Lowering the standard feels compassionate. Until one day, that lowered standard becomes your identity. And then we say things like, that's just who I am. No, that's who you've practiced being. But practices can change. We think discipline is punishment. We think it's harsh, rigid, joyless. But discipline isn't about suffering. It's about clarity. Clarity about what matters enough to be done, even when the mood is gone. Discipline is not saying no to life. It's saying yes to a future you actually want. And the mistake we make is believing discipline must last forever for it to matter at all. It doesn't. It just needs to start momentum. 3 days. That's it. 3 days of doing what you said you would do. Not perfectly, not heroically, just consistently. 3 days where you don't negotiate with the voice that wants comfort over growth. 3 days where excuses are noticed and ignored because something extraordinary happens when you interrupt a pattern. On the first day, you act because you decided to. It feels forced, uncomfortable, almost unnatural. On the second day, resistance shows up louder. This is where most people stop because the mind starts bargaining. Missing once won't matter. You can restart tomorrow. You've already done more than before. But discipline is not about doing more than before. It's about doing what you said. And then comes the third day. And on the third day, something shifts, not externally, internally. You begin to gather evidence that you can be trusted. Evidence that emotions don't get the final vote. Evidence that the version of you who follows through actually exists. And that evidence changes everything. Because confidence is not built by success. It's built by consistency. Strength is not built by intensity. It's built by reliability. And weakness doesn't survive in an environment where promises are kept. This is why 3 days matter. Not because they fix your life, but because they disrupt the story you've been telling yourself. The story that says, I always quit. I never stick to things. I'm just not disciplined. Those stories only exist because you've collected proof to support them. Now you're collecting new proof, and proof is powerful. It reshapes identity. You stop asking, do I feel like doing this? And you start asking, did I say I would? That single shift changes everything, because the strongest people in the room are not the loudest, the smartest, or the most motivated. They are the ones who keep small promises when no one is watching. They understand something most people miss. Discipline is not about control. It's about alignment. Alignment between values and behavior, between intention and action, between who you say you are and how you live when it's inconvenient. And once alignment begins, weakness loses authority. It may still whisper, but it no longer decides. 3 days of discipline won't make you unstoppable, but it will make you believable to yourself. And that belief is the foundation of every meaningful transformation, because momentum doesn't come from dramatic change. It comes from repeated proof, and repeated proof creates trust, and trust creates strength. So if you're waiting for motivation, stop. If you're waiting to feel ready, stop. If you're waiting for the perfect plan, stop. Start with 3 days. 3 days where discipline leads and emotion follows. 3 days where action comes before confidence. 3 days where you practice being the person you say you want to become. Weakness took years to build because it was practiced daily. Strength begins the same way. One promise, one action, 1 day at a time. And it starts now. We often talk about weakness as if it's something we're born with, as if it's a personality trait, as if it's permanent. But weakness is learned. It's learned every time we abandon a commitment because it feels uncomfortable, every time we tell ourselves a story that sounds reasonable in the moment and destructive in the long run, every time relief becomes more important than respect. And over time, those moments stack, not into failure, but into identity. We don't lose confidence all at once, we leak it, one excuse at a time. This is why advice rarely works, because advice speaks to the mind, but weakness lives in the patterns. And patterns are not broken by information. They are broken by interruption. That's what discipline really is. It's not force. It's an interruption of habit. And the reason most people avoid discipline is not because it's hard, but because it exposes the truth. It exposes the gap between who we say we are and what we actually do. That gap is uncomfortable, so we avoid it. We stay busy instead of consistent. We chase motivation instead of structure. We consume inspiration instead of practicing integrity. But inspiration fades, structure stays. And discipline is simply a structure you choose for yourself. The mistake we make is believing discipline must be dramatic to be effective. It doesn't, it just has to be honest. 3 days of discipline sounds almost too simple, so simple that the mind dismisses it. But simplicity is not weakness, simplicity is focus. 3 days is short enough that excuses don't sound intelligent. 3 days is long enough to create evidence, because evidence is what changes behavior. On the first day, discipline feels like resistance. Your body wants familiarity. Your mind wants comfort. That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it right. Growth always feels like friction at first. On the second day, doubt shows up dressed as logic. You start questioning whether this even matters. You start calculating how much progress you've made so far. And that's the trap. Discipline is not measured by progress. It's measured by follow-through. The real work is not finishing. It's showing up again. And then comes the third day. And on the third day, something rare happens. You stop fighting yourself, not because it's easy, but because you've stopped debating. Decision has replaced discussion. And when that happens, energy is freed. This is when discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like alignment. You are no longer arguing with your future. You are cooperating with it. That cooperation builds trust, and trust is the opposite of weakness, because weakness thrives in uncertainty. Strength thrives in certainty. Certainty that when you decide something matters, you will act accordingly. And this certainty doesn't come from motivation. It comes from keeping your word. This is why the most disciplined people don't talk about discipline. They talk about standards. They don't ask, what do I feel like today? They ask, what does this situation require of me? And requirements don't negotiate. 3 days of discipline reintroduce you to standards, not standards imposed by others, standards chosen by you. And when standards are self-chosen, they don't feel oppressive. They feel liberating. Because clarity is freeing. You stop wasting energy on decision-making. You stop draining yourself with inner conflict. You stop carrying the weight of regret. Instead, you carry momentum. And momentum is powerful. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It simply moves forward every day, whether you're watching or not. Weakness can't keep up with momentum. Weakness requires hesitation. It requires negotiation. It requires delay. Momentum eliminates all three. This is why 3 days matter more than 3 weeks of planning. Planning feels productive. Discipline is productive. Thinking about change feels safe. Practicing change feels threatening, but threat is where growth lives. Not threat to safety, threat to identity, because the identity that survives, discipline, is stronger than the one that avoids it. 3 days of discipline won't solve every problem in your life, but it will solve one critical one. It will answer the question, can I trust myself? And once that question is answered, everything else becomes possible. Because the future doesn't belong to the most talented. It belongs to the most reliable. Reliability is strength repeated. So don't wait for courage. Courage follows action. Don't wait for confidence. Confidence is a byproduct of consistency. Choose 3 days, not to transform your life, but to reclaim your authority, because years of weakness were never your destiny. They were simply unchallenged habits, and habits change the moment discipline begins. There is a quiet cost to weakness that no one talks about. It's not failure. It's not embarrassment. It's not even regret. It's drift. Drift happens when days pass without intention, when effort becomes optional, when standards quietly expire, and the danger of drift is not where it takes you today, but where it leaves you years from now. Because drift feels harmless. There's no alarm, no clear moment where everything falls apart, just small decisions that don't feel like decisions at all. This is why so many capable people wake up one day feeling disappointed without knowing exactly when it started. Weakness didn't defeat them, it replaced direction. And direction is what discipline restores. Discipline is not about becoming rigid, it's about becoming deliberate. Deliberate with time, deliberate with energy, deliberate with standards. Without discipline, life decides for you. With discipline, you decide first. The reason this matters is simple. Every decision you make is a vote for the kind of person you believe you are. When you delay, you vote for comfort. When you quit, you vote for relief. When you follow through, you vote for trust. And the votes you cast most often become your identity. That's why weakness feels personal. It's not about what you can't do. It's about what you've stopped believing you can do. And belief doesn't return through thinking. It returns through evidence. 3 days of discipline sound insignificant compared to years of drift. But significance is not measured by duration. It's measured by impact. 3 days are enough to stop the slide. Enough to plant your feet. Enough to remind yourself that you are not stuck. You've just been uncommitted. There's a difference. Being stuck feels permanent. Being uncommitted is a choice, and choices can change quickly. On the first day of discipline, you notice how noisy your mind has become. It questions everything. It looks for exits. It reminds you of every past failure. That's not sabotage, that's exposure. You're seeing the habits that have been running quietly in the background for years. Awareness is uncomfortable but necessary. On the second day, something more subtle appears. Fatigue, not physical fatigue, identity fatigue. The part of you that's used to quitting is tired of being challenged. It wants familiarity back. This is the moment where discipline proves its value, not by how hard you push, but by whether you stay. Staying is the skill. Anyone can start. Few people stay long enough to change how they see themselves. And then comes the third day. And on the third day, there's a moment most people don't expect. Silence. The internal argument fades. The negotiation stops. Not because the task got easier, but because the decision is no longer under debate. This is what discipline actually creates. Peace. Peace comes from knowing there's nothing left to decide. You said you would, so you do. And that peace is powerful. Because peace creates focus. Focus creates consistency. Consistency creates strength. Weakness doesn't disappear on the third day, but it loses influence. It's no longer the voice of authority. It's just noise. And noise can be ignored. What replaces it is something far more valuable than motivation. Self-respect. Self-respect is earned. It's not claimed. It's built through action. And once self-respect is present, standards rise naturally. You stop asking how little you can do. You start asking what's red. That's when discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like alignment. Alignment between intention and behavior, between values and choices, between the person you want to be and the person you practice being. Years of weakness don't come from lack of potential, they come from lack of proof. And proof is built in moments no one applauds. 3 days of discipline won't change how the world sees you, but it will change how you see yourself. And that shift changes everything, because the future is not shaped by dramatic breakthroughs. It's shaped by quiet standards, upheld daily. You don't need a new personality. You don't need a new environment. You don't need a perfect plan. You need a line you refuse to cross, a promise you refuse to break. 3 days is where that line is drawn. Not as a challenge, as a declaration that drift ends here, that comfort no longer outranks commitment, that your word matters again. Weakness survives in ambiguity. Discipline removes ambiguity. And when ambiguity is gone, direction returns. 3 days of discipline are not about proving anything to others. They are about remembering who you are when you decide to lead yourself. And once that memory returns, years of weakness don't stand a chance. At some point, we all reach a moment of quiet frustration, not the kind that explodes, the kind that settles. It shows up when effort doesn't match outcome, when potential feels larger than progress, When we look at our lives and sense a gap we can't quite explain, and in that moment we often search outward for answers. We blame time, we blame circumstances, we blame opportunity, but the real issue is rarely outside us. It's inside the standards we've allowed to slip. Because every life is built on standards, whether we consciously choose them or quietly accept them. And the most dangerous standards are the invisible ones. The ones that say, this is good enough. The ones that say, this doesn't really matter. The ones that say, I'll fix it later. Those standards don't feel like decisions. They feel like relief, and relief is addictive. But relief is expensive. It costs us momentum. It costs us direction. It costs us self-respect. This is why discipline feels heavy to people who've lived without it for too long. Not because it's unnatural, but because it reintroduces responsibility for choices, responsibility for follow-through, responsibility for the gap between intention and action, and responsibility is uncomfortable when we've been avoiding it, but responsibility is also empowering. Because the moment you accept responsibility, you regain control. This is where 3 days of discipline become transformative, not as a productivity tactic, but as a leadership decision. Leadership always starts with self. If you can't lead your time, your energy, and your commitments, you can't lead anything else. 3 days of discipline are not about proving toughness. They're about practicing leadership over your own behavior. On the first day, you feel resistance. Not resistance from the world, resistance from within. The part of you that's grown used to flexibility doesn't want boundaries. It wants options. But leadership doesn't offer options when standards are at stake. Leadership offers clarity. So on day one, clarity feels restrictive. It feels like pressure, but pressure reveals structure. On the second day, awareness increases. You start noticing how often you abandon things not because you can't do them, but because you hesitate. You notice how quickly discomfort triggers escape. And this awareness is unsettling because you realize weakness hasn't been controlling you. You've been permitting it. This is a hard truth, but it's also a hopeful one because permission can be revoked. On the third day, something critical happens. You stop needing to convince yourself. The rules are already set. There's no drama, no inner argument, just execution. And execution builds authority over yourself. That authority changes how you show up everywhere else. You speak with more certainty. You make decisions faster. You tolerate less chaos. Not because you became rigid, but because you became grounded. Discipline grounds you. It anchors you to standards that don't fluctuate with mood. And once anchored, you stop drifting. Drift is what makes years disappear. Drift is what makes goals feel distant. Drift is what makes weakness feel permanent. 3 days of discipline interrupt drift. They reintroduce direction. Direction doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It simply points forward. And when direction is clear, action becomes easier. This is why discipline creates freedom, not limitation. Freedom from indecision. Freedom from regret. Freedom from self-doubt. Self-doubt thrives when promises are broken. It fades when promises are kept. And leadership, real leadership, is built on trust. If you can't trust yourself, everything else becomes fragile. 3 days of discipline are not about becoming flawless. They are about becoming dependable. Dependability is strength in motion. It's what turns intention into impact. It's what turns effort into progress. Weakness doesn't survive in systems that reward dependability. And once you experience what it feels like to rely on yourself again, you don't forget it. You remember what it's like to stand on solid ground. Years of weakness don't vanish overnight, but they lose credibility. They lose the story they've been telling you. The story that says, this is just how it is. This is just who I am. No, this is who you practiced being. And now you're practicing something else. 3 days of discipline are a reset, not a finish line, a foundation. A foundation strong enough to support a future that no longer feels accidental. Because a disciplined life isn't a controlled life. It's a directed one. And direction changes everything. There comes a moment when we realize that time has been fair. Not kind, not generous, just fair. It gave us the same 24 hours again and again. What changed was not time, it was how we used it. And that realization is uncomfortable because it removes excuses, because it places responsibility back where it belongs. Years of weakness don't come from a lack of opportunity. They come from a lack of intention. Intention is not what we hope for. It's what we practice every day, whether we're aware of it or not. We practice something. We practice discipline or delay. We practice courage or comfort. We practice ownership or avoidance. And practice becomes identity. This is why the idea of 3 days of discipline feels almost insignificant. 3 days compared to years of habits, 3 days compared to a lifetime of patterns. But the power of 3 days is not in what they produce, it's in what they prove. They prove that weakness was never permanent. It was just uninterrupted. They prove that discipline is not about force, it's about choice. Choice to act when the feeling isn't there. Choice to continue when recognition is absent. Choice to keep your word when no one is watching. Because the most important audience in your life is always you. And when you disappoint yourself repeatedly, something breaks, not ambition, trust. Trust is fragile. It erodes quietly. And without trust, motivation becomes exhausting. Goals feel distant, effort feels heavy, but trust can be rebuilt. Not through promises, through proof. 3 days of discipline create proof. Proof that your word still has weight. Proof that discomfort doesn't dictate behavior. Proof that direction can be reclaimed. On the first day, you confront your habits. Not the visible ones, the invisible ones. The habit of hesitation, the habit of postponement, the habit of lowering standards when no one is watching. These habits don't feel like weakness, they feel like mercy. But mercy without standards is neglect, and neglect compounds. On the second day, you confront your stories, the stories that explain why you can't, why now isn't the right time, why this attempt will be different from the others. Stories feel safe, but stories don't change outcomes. Only actions do. Discipline interrupts stories. It doesn't argue with them. It acts anyway. And on the third day, you confront your identity, not the one you present, the one you've been living. You notice the gap between who you say you are and who you've been practicing being. And instead of shrinking from that gap, you stand in it. That's where growth lives. Growth doesn't happen when the gap disappears. It happens when you refuse to ignore it. 3 days of discipline won't close the gap, but they will stop it from widening. And that matters, because gaps left unattended become regrets. Regret is not about failure. It's about neglecting potential long enough that it starts to feel unfamiliar. Discipline makes potential familiar again. It reintroduces you to your own capability, not in theory, in action. And once you feel capable again, the future changes shape. It stops feeling overwhelming. It starts feeling directional. Direction is powerful. Direction doesn't require certainty. It requires commitment. Commitment to show up. Commitment to follow through. Commitment to standards that don't fluctuate with mood. Weakness survives N fluctuation. Discipline creates consistency, and consistency builds character. Character is not who you are when things are easy. It's who you are when no one is watching and nothing is urgent. 3 days of discipline are a character test, a quiet one. No applause, no validation. Just you and your word. And when you pass that test, even briefly, something changes. You stop waiting for permission to take yourself seriously. You stop negotiating with the part of you that wants comfort more than growth. You begin to lead yourself. And self-leadership is the foundation of every meaningful life. Years of weakness are not a life sentence. They are a signal that standards were unclear, that commitments were flexible, that direction was optional. 3 days of discipline make direction non-negotiable. They draw a line not to punish the past, but to protect the future, because the future doesn't need a perfect version of you. It needs a reliable one, and reliability is built the same way strength is built. One decision, repeated, without drama. 3 days is not the end. It's the beginning of remembering who you are when you decide to honor your word. And once you remember that, weakness no longer defines you. It becomes a chapter, not the story.